You've made a very, very difficult decision here to reopen partially on May 26th. And it's something I know the rest of Wall Street and really the world is watching very closely to see how you do it and what else they can learn from it. Can you give us a sense? You've said the choreography will be very different here on what it'll look like at the beginning stages of reopening.
Hi, thanks so much for having me, Sonali. It is an important decision, and it wasn't taken lightly. It was taken in consultation with public authorities, public health experts, but we put a plan in place that will be the first phase of our reopening. And what we'll do is the market makers that are typically standing at the posts around me right now will continue to work remotely. They're larger firms. They can do a lot of what they do from remote locations. And then the brokers that are small independent firms that are typically stand around the trading floor will come in the first phase. And so that won't require a lot of movement around the floor. We can limit interactions among people to just as an initial phase to get us back in and help those businesses that are most impacted get started.
What are some of the most important measures you think you'll be taking from the get-go to ensure safety of the people who are coming back in? And what will it look like in terms of density on the floor?
So given the protections that we've learned that are helpful to protect against COVID-19, everyone in the building and everyone on the trading floor will be wearing a mask at all times. We'll have 6 feet social distancing minimums applied across the trading floor. We're asking employees that come into the building not to use public transportation just initially because the shelter at home orders are still in place, and we're trying to respect those restrictions that the governor and the city have in place by keeping them us off of the subways and the public transportation systems, so we can leave that capacity for essential frontline workers in the healthcare system, and as well as limiting the exposure of different people that we're interacting with, so like keeping that much more controlled. We'll have temperature screening and medical screening as people come into the building. Some of the measures that we used in place at the end of March, but then layering on additional, such as PPE and social distancing restrictions.
And as we were saying, this must have been a very difficult decision. On the onset, what is your biggest concern as you start to open up?
Yeah, the decision-making process was about who's impacted most by these closures and how can we get to an increased level of service. We're going to live with this pandemic for a long time. We're not on the other side of it yet, and we're not going to be for quite some time. We can't leave the economy closed, but we can be thoughtful about what parts of it we reopen and how do we do that. So our plan is designed to focus our attention on slowly re-entering in a very cautious and very thoughtful, measured way, so that we can get that economy to reopen and start moving again without adding undue risk on the system. So we're not looking and we're not expecting that we're going to eliminate the likelihood of any case of COVID-19 because there is a pandemic that we're all living with. But our measures are designed to reduce the risk of an outbreak, and that's an important distinction. We've also are coming into this knowing that it's going to need to be a flexible situation. While we've outlined phase 1 and we have plans to increase the level over time, we also recognize that we might need to contract over time as local conditions change. And I think that's important for us all to be considering. How do we open up and start to re-enter and be ready to pull back as needed? This is going to be a learning curve, as this entire experience has been for all of us, right. But we learn so much week to week, and that's the information that we need to use as we make decisions.
Stacey, much lower density at the beginning, of course, in terms of people in the building, wearing masks, you've already said, and we've seen a lot of the market makers be able to function electronically, not being able to come back right away. Do you think that some of the changes we're seeing at this time will permanently change some of the fabric of the New York Stock Exchange?
Well, what we've seen is that while the community has been able to operate remotely and we've been able to execute IPOs and still have complex transactions. In fact, today I'm standing right next to the logo of ADC Therapeutics, that is one of the largest biotech IPOs of the year, just priced this morning, and that happened remotely with the DMMs. While we can operate remotely, we operate better when we have people involved. And the data actually has been a really interesting, this has been an interesting experience to measure. And we can actually see, and the data supports, that we do operate better when human judgment is involved. So we'll go back to that full level of service. And this is just the first step getting us there.
So what is some of that data, and also what is some of the value of the floor here? Obviously, a great sense of history, a lot of marketing value around the IPOs. So what is some of that value that and how long will it be restored, do you think, as we come back to normalcy when we don't really know when that is?
Yeah, the floor has tremendous marketing value, as we all know. We see it on TV every single day, but it's so much more than that. The judgment that's applied by these independent brokers on the floor, as well as our market makers, reduces volatility in stocks. And what we've seen, and what the data has supported throughout this period of time, is that there's greater amount of volume at the bid and offer each day, especially around the closing auction, when the floor is open. So we've been able to study that period of time, and what we saw prior to March 23rd, when we closed, and what we've seen after. And you can see a marked difference in how efficient the markets are. While it's still better than many electronic auctions out there, and still best in class, we know we can do better, and so we want to make sure we can bring back that human judgment. Anytime you combine and really well integrate human judgment with technology, you get a better outcome.
Right, and I feel like, speaking some of that marketing value, and I know the data shows about the closing in opening auctions, but still, it was just 1 year ago that we were there with the Uber IPOs and the Slack IPOs, and I'm wondering, with this kind of market and some of the volatility surrounding it, when can some of that come back?
Yeah, I mean, you'd be surprised. I mentioned we had an IPO today. We have another one lined up for next week. We've raised over $12 billion of capital since the floor closed on March 23rd, whether through IPOs or follow-on offerings. Many of the companies that are feeling the stress of this COVID-19 pandemic have come to the equity markets to raise money to support their businesses, like Carnival Cruise Lines, like Darden Restaurants. We've seen a number of large follow-on offerings in the equity space, and we've seen IPOs. We've also seen a large number of special purpose acquisition corporations raising money in the public markets during this period of time. And I think that's indicative of investors recognizing that there will be opportunities out there, and they want to be ready to take advantage of them.
Stacey, another role that you play is on Mayor de Blasio's advisory council when it comes to reopening larger parts of the city. One big question is, are state and local governments going to do more to reduce liability of companies as they start to reopen? Do you have a sense on what can be done?
You know, it's hard to say. It's still early days to determine whether or not the government will take any action on that front. I know people are thoughtful about what they're doing. If you look at other illnesses or viruses, it's not typical for businesses to have any liability about when somebody contracts those. So it's still hard to say what might happen on that front. But I know certainly a lot of CEOs that I talk to are thinking about it. But their top priority is how do we keep our employees safe, and that's really what they're focused on.
So can you give us a sense on what the city can be doing, especially as you're starting to test some of these reopening plans as well? What can the city do to bring us back to some sense of normalcy?
The city and the state have both been fantastic about soliciting feedback from businesses, both small and large, across the board, to understand what are the challenges that they're facing. Those are the questions that I get from the mayor and the governor, and on those committees we talk about what are your biggest concerns so that they can determine where do they need to turn their attention. Things like childcare, things like transportation systems, and making sure that we're not putting too much strain on the healthcare system. Those are the types of things that we're talking about, and getting input from those that employ so many people around, you know, not just New York City or New York State, but the U.S. is an important part of that process. There are 45 million people directly employed by companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange. All of those CEOs are trying to make good decisions about how to move forward in a measured and thoughtful way. We're trying to help them by hosting conference calls, virtual calls, and virtual events with public health experts and economists so they can make those decisions. But we're all in this together, and we're all going to find our way through it together.